What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? Keto diets are based on the proposition that for those predisposed to become obese and or diabetic, carbohydrate-rich foods trigger that predisposition. That isn't because of the calories they contain, as the conventional thinking on keto diets are based on that the obesity assumes, but because of the effect these foods have on insulin, the hormone that dominates the regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism. Insulin is secreted mostly in response to carbohydrates, not just in the form of sugars, starches, and grains, whole or otherwise, but also fruits and legumes, which are the staples of a well-formulated plant-based diet. A high insulin level signals fat synthesis and storage, and a low level its release as free fatty acid back into the circulation, observed the Harvard University metabolism and diabetes researcher George F. Cahill Jr. in 1971 in the prestigious Banting Memorial Lecture at the annual meeting of the American Diabetes Association. This process is like a switch. When fat cells sense the presence of insulin in the circulation, as Cahill described it, they respond by storing fat and inhibiting its release, and we get fatter. When insulin is undetectable, we burn stored fat or fuel, and we get leaner. The metabolic state of ketosis, from which the keto diet gets its name, happens when carbohydrates are restricted almost entirely and fat provides most of the fuel for the body. The hormonal insulin-centric regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism remains textbook medicine. Yet its relevance to obesity has been effectively ignored by nutritionists and obesity researchers who have overwhelmingly preferred to think that all calories are equally capable of stimulating fat accumulation, that we get fat because we overeat, not because the carbohydrates we consume have some unique ability to stimulate fat accumulation. For some significant proportion of Americans, however, remaining relatively lean and healthy may require minimizing their insulin secretion. This, in turn, means more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrate-rich foods. Animal-sourced foods, meat, fish, fowl, and even processed meat, typically make up the bulk of this approach to weight control because they are almost entirely protein and fat with minimal carbohydrates. Until insulin was discovered in 1921 and insulin therapy was put to use in treating diabetes, these diets were known as animal diets. They were the standard of care for diabetes, delaying death in what today is called type 1 diabetes, the insulin-dependent form, and controlling the disease indefinitely in those with type 2, the common form associated with excess weight and age. This is still the case. Again, Brenda, what are your thoughts on that passage from Gary Taubes?
It covers an awful lot of material, but essentially, if what he said were actually true, you would think, probably be reflected in diabetes rates around the world. And in fact, some of the lowest rates of diabetes that we see are in populations that are actually at the higher end of the carbohydrate spectrum. Just think about the people in the blue zones. They average about 62% of their calories as carbohydrates. The people in Bolivia, the Semeni, I think they're called Semeni people, they average 72% of calories from carbohydrates, and they have among the lowest rates of heart disease and diabetes on the planet. And we have so many studies that have very clearly demonstrated that excess fat leads to greater fat accumulation than excess carbohydrates. And actually, I'm not just saying that this theory was actually put to the test in the most rigorous form of trial that we have. It's called a metabolic ward trial. And there was a study done in 2020 that involved 20 overweight men and women, and they were kept in a metabolic ward where they had no access to any food other than what was provided to them. And the study was a crossover design. So this means that you're put on a certain diet for a set period of time, and then you cross over to another diet. And this study was really interesting because it compared a keto diet, which was 75% of calories from fat and 10% of calories from carbohydrate. So it was a fairly moderate keto diet, to a low-fat vegan diet that was 75% of calories from carbohydrate and 10% of calories from fat. So the exact opposite. And, what it was, they basically have complete control over what their participants are doing. And while the keto diet did lower blood glucose and insulin and triglycerides compared to the vegan diet, it actually impaired glucose tolerance and it increased loss of muscle. And glucose tolerance, this is all about insulin resistance. And so what they found is it actually made insulin resistance worse, which is not what you're trying to accomplish. And the other thing that was really interesting is the vegan diet resulted in over 3 times more fat loss than the keto diet. So it was triple the fat loss. What the keto people were losing was more muscle tissue, whereas the vegans were losing more fat. And so he can say what he wants, but the evidence is really clear. By eating animal-sourced foods like meat, fish, fowl, processed meat, you are essentially doing one thing. You are cutting out the components that we know in the diet are most protective against diabetes. Things like fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants and sterols and stanols and unsaturated fats and a lot of the micronutrients that are concentrated in plants, like folate, for example. You are essentially maximizing the pro-inflammatory compounds such as saturated fat and oxidized cholesterol and nitrates and TMAO and endotoxins and new 5-GC and all the products of oxidation you get when you cook meat, like heterocyclic amines, environmental contaminants. All of those things are heightened when you're eating a diet that's predominantly animal products. And that, there are benefits associated with low carbohydrate diets in terms of reducing insulin secretion, for example, but they are very short term. These diets are associated with weight loss, but no more than what plant-based diets are associated with. They do tend to do a few things that are positive, but there are so many known disadvantages that it's not worth the risk, in my view, especially when carbohydrate intakes are below 50 grams a day, which they are in keto diets. And just to give you an example, the impacts, they increase LDL cholesterol, they reduce kidney function or they damage kidney function, they increase risk of kidney stones, and they mess up gut microflora. They are bad for bone health. They're bad for nutritional status. They cause inflammation. They impair athletic performance. They just do a whole whack of horrible things. And people that are on these diets, generally what you see is they complain of constipation and headaches and bad breath and muscle weakness. And in the long term, low carbohydrate diets increase mortality. They increase our exposure to persistent organic pollutants. They reduce bone density. They impair artery function. They increase risk of cardiovascular disease. They have even been associated with birth defects and possibly colon cancer because they're so high in meat. It just makes no sense to me that if somebody actually looks at the literature, that they would come up with the kinds of pronouncements that Gary Taubes makes.